I'm Dan Williams. I'm an EOS implementer, certified EOS implementer, but I'm also the community leader for the APAC region. So in the community leader role, my responsibilities include representing us on the global stage, but also supporting our implementer community within the APAC region, which there are 30 EOS implementers in APAC, which is great. Part of the the larger community of nearly 600 EOS implementers around the world. So I appreciate you taking out some time. We've put aside 1 hour for today. I'll try not to fill that with me talking for an hour. I'd like to leave some time for questions so that you can ask anything that you'd like to. We've got some instructions in there as well. When we do get to questions, I'd love for you, I'll remind you again, but I'd love for you to raise your hand. We've got lots of people in that room, so hopefully we can hear you and distinguish who's asking the question, and I'll do my best to help as we go. All right, so if everyone is ready, I'll get this underway. All right, so like I said, my name's Dan Williams. I'm going to be taking you through the data component of the EOS model. But to do that, I probably should give you some context first. So just bear with me for a moment while I adjusted my screen so that I could see you. Just going to move this over so I can still see you. All right, so the EOS model is made up of 6 components, the strong in 6 and 6 wigs. There's a definite theme there. So I'm going to run you through the full model. So the EOS model is designed with your business at the center and helping you to take control of your business. The first of the components is the vision component. So the vision component is about getting everyone on the same page with where we're headed as a business. We have a set of 8 questions that we answer that will help us to establish a vision that we can then share with the rest of the business. The people component is about having the right people in the right seats. And one of the greatest rewards as an EOS implementer is to see a leadership team take shape over that journey and really strengthen that people component. And as an entrepreneur and business owner myself, it's something that has probably yielded the most lessons throughout my career, is how important it is to have the right people in the right seats. Seems obvious now that I say that out aloud. The next component is the data component. So the data component, we're going to go really deep into this today, but it kind of brings sort of sanity to our vision. So it's all well and good to know where we're headed and have the right people in the right seats. But if we aren't measuring and managing our numbers, then we can run out of runway pretty quickly. So it's pretty important. Well, it's more than pretty important. It's crucial to be strong in data. And then when we have clarity of vision, we've got the right people in the right seats, or we know who the right people in the right seats are, and we've got clarity of our numbers, we create what we call a lucid organization. And then what happens is issues lift to the surface. And so the issues component is about having visibility and creating a culture of visibility of our issues within the business, and then having a consistent way to deal with them and prioritize them as we work through. And then the process component, which we've just released a new book, which I didn't plan this, but I have it here actually. a new book, which is called, it's a really clever title. The book is called Process. And it's addressing the sad fact that the process component is the weakest component in most businesses. So the book was, we were so motivated. Lisa Gonzalez and Mike Payton, who are peers of mine, have co-authored the book Process. And that's about having clarity of your core processes within your business and then documenting them. You can't buy you could buy the book in Australia, but it's sold out. So I jumped on Amazon last week. I'm Amazon Prime. I've got a bit of an Amazon Prime issue myself. That's a whole other webinar. And you can pre-order it from there. I think they're expected next month. I recommend it. All right, and so the next component is the traction component. So the traction component, quite satisfyingly, is at the bottom of the wheel. That's where we get rubber to the road And that includes things like knowing what your key objectives are, which we call ROCs, focusing on 90 days at a time, achieving your objectives 90 days at a time, and then a healthy meeting pulse that helps that all come together. So what we're going to focus on today is the data component. And so the data component is about, like I said, having clarity of our numbers and strength of our numbers. And, you know, I've been an owner in a number of businesses. I had an IT business for about 17 years, and that's a data obsessed industry, but that's not really something you should take for granted. It's about knowing the numbers that are most important. It's not a competition to see how many things we can measure. It's about knowing what is most important. And I'm going to share one of my favorite quotes with you right now. If we have data, let's look at the data. If all we have are opinions, then let's go with mine. It's funny, and it's a little sad, because if we don't have data, then we're just guessing and potentially making the wrong guesses. And so knowing the data that is most important to your business is absolutely critical. I've worked with close to 50 different businesses as their EOS implementer. And this is something that I obsess over. And really early in the process of implementing EOS as a key part of the entrepreneurial operating system, we build the scorecard. Actually, right from day one, we start building the scorecard. It's because that is one of the most critical tools. So I often, in the book Traction, hopefully you've read Traction by Gino Wickman. It's our book that is like our source of truth on this operating system. Gino tells a story of a pilot. The captain makes an announcement over the loudspeaker to the passengers on the plane and says, we've got some good news and some bad news. We'll go with the bad news first, is that we've lost all instruments on our dash in the plane. We've lost our speed, our altitude, our fuel levels. We don't have any of that information, but the good news is that we're on time. So that just kind of paints the picture of just how important it is. And it's the truth is they wouldn't have known if they were on time or not. But I treat the scorecard as like your instrument cluster as a leader in the business or an owner in the business. You need to be able to look at that and know, like in your car, how much fuel is in the tank, how fast you're going, how many revs is the engine running at, what's the temperature, all of these things, taking that logic as the first discipline in the data component to build a scorecard for your company. And so that scorecard, you don't want it to be a long, exhaustive list, because you'll spend too much time focusing on the dash and not enough on the road. We just need to have visibility of our critical measurables. So in every business, there will be a handful. We prescribe 5 to 15 measurables. So if you think less is more, I used to always challenge my leaders to get that down to a smaller handful of numbers. And we used to often say, just imagine that you were on a tropical island. We'll keep it APAC. We'll say we're in Fiji, poolside, or sitting on a lounge at the beach in Fiji, and someone handed you the scorecard. You'd want to know quickly at a glance the health of the business. You wouldn't want to have to put down your cocktail for too long and study the numbers. You want to know quickly whether the business was on track to achieve its goals. So that's why we go for a less is more approach. So once we know what your measurables are, then we set a goal for those. So the scorecard is something that we're going to be looking at weekly. So I encourage you to try and fill your scorecard with what we call leading metrics. So they're numbers that are going to tell us on a week-to-week basis whether we're going to be on track to hit our longer term, our lagging metrics, our longer term goals. And you also want to be able to do something with that number in that week. So if Anthony is accountable for, or Anne even, Anthony's accountable for weekly revenue and it's off track in that week, then we need to be able to do something about it. If it's a lagging number and it's off track in that week, we don't want the response to be, well, we'll see what it will be at the end of the quarter. our scorecard should give us actionable data on a week-to-week basis. And we want to be able to then look at that measurable, know what the measurable is and why it's important, look at our goal and ask ourselves, are we on track to hit that goal or not? Welcome, Sally. And then also, who's accountable for that number? Because if we get to, say, well, who have we got here? Claire in accounts payable, and our number is off track. We want to say to Claire, so let's put that on our issues list and let's work through it. And we want to empower Claire to go and do something about it. And one of the really critical disciplines in a scorecard is once you have that measurable, you know what your goal is, who's accountable for it, you want to measure at least 13 weeks of data. So the reason being is if we just capture a really small sample size, it could just be something that's happening in the business at that point in time, and we don't have context of how that looked over an extended period of time. And also, if we get 13 weeks of data, which is a full quarter, we can look back on it and say, well, was that red, therefore off track, because maybe the goal is too high, or maybe there's an underlying process problem, or maybe there's just something that that we need to address, that we could potentially measure something else that'll be more useful to help us affect that number next quarter. And so then as a leader, you're able to look at it and say, okay, so our sales calls, that goal must be about right. We were exceeding it most weeks, but there was a couple of weeks there where we didn't. And then we can look back on it and say what happened in those 2 weeks. Hopefully that makes sense. So there are lots of things that you can measure. So that scorecard is the first discipline. The other discipline in the data component is measurables. And so we're kind of spoiled for choice. There are a lot of accounting systems and softwares and ERP and SaaS-based applications these days that have a lot of this stuff built in. I use the Xero platform for accounting. There are so many reports in there. There's lots of measurables. But I encourage you to think about, in your business, what are the most important numbers for you to know on a weekly basis? If you're a project services or project or professional service oriented business, you might have things like projects on time, project milestones delivered on time, or it could have budget variance. If you're in a as a service business, a subscription service business, it might be number of active subscribers or net new subscribers. So you need to really ask yourself, what are the most important numbers for me to know on a weekly basis as a leader in this business? And so there are lots of examples on the screen there, and you're not going to probably struggle to find numbers, to be honest. But the most important thing is to distill that down into the most valuable numbers. You don't want to be looking at a really long list of numbers that and they all relate to each other. I encourage you to think about what are the most important and to distill that down. The second part of the second discipline of the data component is what we call measurables. So we have a tool which relates to the people component, which is called the accountability chart. And so the accountability chart is effectively a map of your organization based on the functions of the organization. It's kind of like an org chart, but far more useful because it's based on the needs of the business. It has every seat, every function in the business, has what the 5 roles are, and then it has people's names in it. So we have a goal. It's part of the organizational checkup, which is an assessment that you can do. That is, everyone has a number and is held accountable to it. So the scorecard is your weekly finger on the pulse, and the measurables is about knowing how each seat and function in the business contributes, and to know quickly whether they are achieving what they need to or not. One of my other favorite stories from the book Traction is in a steel mill, and the leader and the team leader in that business is trying to think about how he can motivate the team to succeed and to achieve what the business needs from them. And one of the shift supervisors, I'm localizing the story a little bit, at the end of their shift writes on the floor of the factory with chalk, how many runs of steel they produced in that shift. And then the next shift supervisor comes in and says, what's this number on the floor that Mark has drawn? Well, it's how many runs of steel they produced in the last shift. And they say, well, I can do better than that. And so the next shift, they're trying to do better and better. And obviously you want to maintain quality control. You don't want to max out the system and reduce the quality of steel that we're producing, but that became their measurable. How many runs of steel did they produce in that shift? And so if you knew that number for each seat, every function in the business, it is incredibly powerful. And for two reasons. One of them is, as a leader, you know whether they're hitting that target, whether they're producing what they need to or not. But then also as a team member or as an employee, you know what your number is. And you know that you can have that single focus of the thing that you need to produce. Now, business is far more complex than that, but you can generally pick one number, one measurable for each function in the business that is their key number. So I've worked with quite a number of IT service providers as their EOS implementer. And they have all of these dashboards and widgets and things that go beep that they can measure all of these numbers. And I often say to them, what is the most critical number for, say, someone on your help desk? And what I see really commonly is all these service level indicators or service level agreements, but really they just want their phones answered within a certain amount of time. And it's often usually a small window, like 15, 30 seconds. And I just said to them, what about if that was the measurable for your help desk to answer the phone within 15 seconds? And if they did that, you knew that they were on track. And then apply that logic to every function in the business, right from the people answering the phone through to people balancing your books at the end of the month or quarter, and knew what their measurable was. And that takes us to what 100% strong in this data component looks like. We have a handful of numbers that are our weekly finger on the pulse of the most important numbers. And we call that a scorecard. And we're able to hold people accountable to the goal and do something if it's off track. Picture being on that beach in Fiji, and we know whether the business is on track or not. That's the power of that scorecard. We're away from the business and it gives us that intel. And everyone in the company has a number and is held accountable to it. That is 100% strong in the data component. And this is, like I said, that it's that sanity part to our vision. So if I just recap those 6 components again quickly, the vision is about knowing where we're headed and staying on the same page. People component's about having the right people in the right seats. And the data component is about having having a grip on the performance of the business as we track towards our goals. So I like to say that the vision is kind of the head in the clouds and the data is the feet on the ground. You kind of need both. If you're going to have relevance and sustainability long-term in the business, you have to be really strong in the vision component. If you're going to have any hope of fulfilling that, you need to have the right people in the right seats. But if you're going to have longevity and sustainability, you need to be strong on data. And then just a reminder, the issues component, all the issues start to come to the surface when you've got visibility of right people, right seat, clarity of vision, handle of your numbers. And then quite often, I think the process component is quite cleverly follows issues, because quite a lot of your issues will be process related. So we then strengthen the process component, have our core processes documented, and then we're able to channel all that into what is most important for us in that quarter, in that week, in the form of objectives, which we call rocks, and then a healthy meeting pulse that keeps us on track to deliver. That is the data component in the context of the EOS model. I've got through a lot of content in a really short space of time there. So just a couple of key things that I'm going to recap, and then I'd love to throw it open to any questions. I'm just going to skip back to this, back to the scorecard quickly. So your scorecard will be different in your business. probably not wildly different to what's on the screen. But the interesting thing about scorecards is they're never once and done either. It's never, this is my scorecard and I'm just going to watch that forever. You will learn things through measuring numbers, that maybe there is a better way to measure something. Maybe there's a more useful number to know on a weekly basis. Maybe the goal needs to be increased or decreased. This is something that you need to stay on top of as a leadership team and to be constantly querying it. I have some companies that I work with as their EOS implementer that once a year completely flip their scorecard. Well, they'll just say once a year, maybe after the end of the financial year, let's just wipe our scorecard and start again. And so what I find is about 70% of the numbers come back and they just revise the goals, but they'll then challenge and say, okay, other 30% of numbers that we've added back in are giving us something new to focus on. And it's not always a matter of scrapping a number if you're not hitting it. It's about saying, what else can we measure to help us get to that number? I can give you a real life example where a company I was working with, they were measuring employee satisfaction on a weekly basis. They had a target that they were trying to hit on a number out of 10 on a week-to-week basis. And so they had on their scorecard, employee satisfaction. The team member who was accountable was in the people and culture seat in that business. And their goal was to have 8 out of 10. And no matter what they did, they seemingly couldn't get to that 8 out of 10. So what they did then was thought, you know what, rather than continually trying to pursue that number, what else can we do? What else can we measure? And so when they looked into the data as to why their employee satisfaction wasn't where they wanted it to be, the number one factor was that the team members didn't feel like they spent enough time with their manager. So what they then did cleverly replace that number. Instead of just continuing to measure employee satisfaction, they put a goal on their scorecard, number of one-on-one meetings held with team members on a week-to-week basis. They looked around the room. There were 5 people on the leadership team. They said, we think we can do 2 each every week. So they had a shared goal of 10. People and culture was accountable to make sure that that was done. And then what happened was they started to hit that number. They started to hit their 10 one-on-one meetings as a team every week. And then when they look back at the employee satisfaction data at the end of that quarter, they'd exceeded their original goal of 8. It was now approaching 9 out of 10. And it was all because they looked at it every week on that scorecard and could now do something about it. Whereas that employee satisfaction number, they felt like it was too far. It was too much of a lag. So that's why it's never once and done. You need to continually think, what else could I be measuring? And if you're continually missing a goal and the number is right, then think about what else could I be measuring that helps me to move the dial on that number? Hopefully that makes sense. And one other tip is that process component, which I don't think I'm doing the session on process, but hopefully I'll give them a heads up. Quite often behind your numbers is a process. So if I look at the sales calls number, and that's being missed week after week after week, and we just keep going and talking to the sales team, we've missed our sales calls number, we need to do better. Think about what the process is that's behind that, because that process there might be a sales process or an opportunity process. Then that first step is being missed. And so then you're able to have more of a targeted conversation about that number. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hopefully you learned something. And if you already knew, hopefully it's reinforced your knowledge of the data component. And that's a lot of me talking, nearly half an hour of me talking. And I don't have the most exciting voice. I probably should have warned you at the start. And I don't have a good voice for radio like Rob does, who joined us a little late. Welcome, Rob. I'd love to throw it open to you. If you have any questions look, this is meant to be about the data component, but I've never really been a rule follower. I'm happy to answer any questions that you like. And if they're about the data component, then I'll probably get a better feedback on this recording when it's watched back. If you have any questions, please, you can use the raise hand function. Anthony, awesome. I might stop sharing. Is that okay? You happy to be live and large on the screen?
Yep.
Thanks. Anthony, what's your question?
Okay, so actually, what my question is related to your last point, which was very interesting to me about the internal satisfaction. So it was like a management. It wasn't really a customer, customer goal, how many customers, how much money we're making. It was more about, the how you managers, because we're using EOS, and the main thing that's coming out of it is it's so useful for our management, our middle managers, let's say.
Yeah.
And so what you mentioned there was, how to, because especially managers, often their goals are sort of harder to quantify in a way, because they're doing tasks that are changing all the time, right? It's not like they're doing the routine things like sales calls and, invoices sent out. They've got goals that are personal goals for each of their team members and so forth. So it's quite hard to quantify. So that particular point you mentioned about how many one-on-ones. So my question is, in the context of that, especially in terms of people training or manager training, what other data figures or what other data are you looking at?
Yeah.
Or in your experience, that was like a really good one, but what are the other ones?
So it doesn't always need to be, you don't need to put yourself under pressure that the measurable needs to be something that is like a financial thing or a production thing or an output even. I like to challenge teams to think about some of the inputs. And so if you can measure activity, so like that one-on-one meetings is a really important one to that business, because that was at that point in time an issue in their business. And so they measured that for probably 2 quarters, and then they got an appetite to then go back and look at the data and say, so what's the other feedback are they giving us, and what else can we measure? And so if you take that thirst and that interest in what's behind those numbers, then you'll find interesting things that you can measure. There's another one that kind of relates to like receivables. So I work with some companies that have, their receivables, their debtors are growing, especially through COVID, when people were watching their spending a little bit more and maybe taking a little longer to pay bills. They came up with an idea that they were going to give people a 3% discount if they paid early or on time. And so next, they kept measuring their receivables, because that was pretty important. And then they had a measurable on their scorecard, the amount of uptake in that week, how many people took up the 3% discount. And so then what they were able to do is see that receivables number shrink and how many people were taking up. And that was just a manual number that was entered in every week by the person who was accountable for it. But it was really interesting. And then behind that led to their process being reviewed, their receivables process. And they then adopted a direct debit policy, where instead of asking people to pay earlier on, on time, or early is before it's due, if you've got like a 14-day, credit terms, and on time is probably on day 14. So then they decided, actually, we need to have a direct debit policy where instead of getting that behavior 3% discount for this, give them a 5% discount to just go straight on direct debit. And so that behavior was driven by measuring a number. So it's not always about having like a dashboard concept of like the dashboard, the dial hits this. Sometimes it can be just measuring things that is about changing behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, would you say that in your work as an implementer, that one of the biggest problems is that people just have too much data? I mean, so we've got the leadership data, which is just showing company health. But then for each of the departments, they've got their data. And then for each individual, they've got their data. And so it just stacks on. So, we got about 5 or 6 departments, and each of, there's another, let's say 8 things that we're looking at there. And then each individual person there has got another 1 or 2 things separately. And you just end up with
So
like numbers and
yeah,
numbers.
that
But if you
is that
don't do
is
that, then your departments don't have their goals and they don't achieve. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, and so that's where I'm going to help you make a distinction in EOS terms, at least, the difference between a scorecard and a dashboard, or a scorecard measurable and a KPI. They're different. So the scorecard in the context of EOS is something that we look at once a week. So what's the most useful number for me to know about that department, or inside the department, maybe that individual, on a week-to-week basis. So you can still have dashboards and KPIs and all those sorts of things, but this is stop once a week and look at, because the beautiful thing about the problem that's created by having too much data is that we have the freedom of choice. What is the most valuable number if I was part of a leadership team with you, Anthony, and you were in the sales department, the most important number that I would probably want to know as a business owner is what's the weighted pipeline for your sales.
Yeah.
So that's my favorite number as a business owner, because sales can tell me all these sorts of things, like, how many opportunities are in the system. That's great. That's kind of fantasy land. But how many, and based on weighting, and I'd probably pick a part of your funnel that is the most likely to convert. And I want to know what that number is on a week-to-week basis, and just that number. And then obviously, if you can't tell me what that number is, then that might be a process problem. So, there's so many layers, but just if I was to pick one, and I often, as an EOS implementer, I instruct departmental teams to try and pick numbers that is to the benefit of more than just one person in that department. So if we have a departmental scorecard and there's a number that is for an appointment setter, think about a number that is, so it doesn't become an individual thing, it's to the benefit of the team. Because you can then also, like that example that I gave, you can challenge your scorecard regularly. I wouldn't be changing it during the quarter, but if you got to the end of the quarter and you look back and thought that number actually wasn't valuable, we didn't really have a lot of good conversation about it, weren't able to do something when it was off track, let's swap that out for something else. And what happens is, it's usually, I don't want to be too prescriptive, but I'd say we talk about EOS implementation as being like a roughly a 2-year sort of mental commitment as EOS implementers, like a 2-year journey to get to what we call 80 strong, which is 80% strong in all the 6 components. Beyond that point, your EOS implementer doesn't dump you. You have an opportunity there to say, are we 80 strong in all components? Do we want to continue with the implementer, or do we want to go on our own? So in that time, there's a lot of iterations, there's lots of reviewing and learning and getting better. But what will happen is we have a tool called the Level 10 meeting that is one of my favorites, because it becomes like the center pin. But you have like an ecosystem. Just imagine 2 years in, you have an ecosystem of level 10 meetings throughout the business. You might have a operations, a sales, a finance, a leadership team. You might have several operations department level 10 meetings, and they'll all have their own scorecard.
Yep.
And then the leadership team scorecard just becomes a roll-up of the most important numbers in each of those departments. There's no sense in looking at different things. We should be all looking at the same sort of data. So I used to challenge in my business that I implemented EOS in with an implementer started about 8 years ago. I sold out of the business after 17 years, 3 years ago. We used to have 5 numbers on the scorecard, and those 5 numbers was 1 from each department.
Right.
And we knew that if that number was on track, the business was healthy, and so too was that department.
Right. So you might have 5 from each department, and then if you go into each department, they'll have another 5, let's say. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
I
those
think
will
that,
be accountable to each different person in that department. And then you go into the individuals, they might have a couple of more themselves, something like
yeah,
that.
I'd say that individuals don't really need a scorecard as such. They need eyes on the data. But I at an individual level, I think you're better off using like KPIs and dashboards, like real time, and then the scorecards to the benefit of their team or their department. And then if you imagine you have an operations department that's got 3 functional departments, then your operations department scorecard could be a roll up of the 5 or so, it doesn't have to be 5 numbers that are most useful to know. And then that logic then applies. I'm going to run out of space up the you go up to the next level. And that logic, I've seen that work really well, and it's empowering as well. So if I'm Christine and I'm head of operations, and my number, what I think is the most valuable number, I bring that to the leadership team, and the leadership team, I'm then accountable to make sure that that number is on track. And if it's off track and I go back to my team, they're also looking at that number. So it's not a us and them, it's actually shared. That data it's not a special set for the leadership team, a special set for the department, and creates like a chain of responsibility.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Dan, for the clarification.
I'm pretty passionate about this component. Maybe that's why they chose me to do this one. Are there any other questions? Thank you for that, Anthony. It was great. Sorry if I layered on the answers, but yeah, hopefully you got something. Does anyone else have any questions about the data component or EOS in general? Mark?
Yes, just wondering what your view is on whether or not a number should be naturally collected within the business, or you think that it's okay to create a new process around extracting a number or obtaining a number. And that could probably apply to, I guess, KPIs and the scorecard equally, I guess.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly, so you can so one of the problems that is also created by having lots of data is sometimes the effort to turn that into something meaningful. So when we go through the focus day, which is the first day of implementing EOS in the EOS process, I always run through, and because I've done it so many times, I have to hold back because sometimes it's like, when you're trying to teach your child how to do something, how it's going to end up, but you've still got to let them go through that process anyway. In the focus day, when we build the scorecard for the first time, people are just throwing ideas out, and I can fill a whiteboard. I have a 3 meter by 1.2 meter whiteboard, and I can fill it with scorecard measurable ideas. But then when I say, tell me the ones here that you can actually measure, and then we circle the ones that they can measure, and it's about 1/10 sometimes of what's on the board. And then others, they just say, oh, if we had a means to measure that, that would be really valuable. So you can find yourself in a position where there could be like a process related to extracting your data that is valuable. And I'm all for that. In fact, I work with a data and analytics business. They do like big data warehousing and analysis. And that's their superpower, is that they, whenever we talk about reliability of data or availability of data, they're like, oh, we've got a bot that can do that. And then they automate it, and then they have all these beautiful dashboards and widgets. And then I just go back to the advice that I gave Anthony. So what's actually useful of this, and what's valuable to know on a weekly basis? So I don't know if that helps, but if it's serving the cause of strengthening the data component, which is about having our finger on the pulse of the most important numbers week to week, then I'm all for it. And I'd say, and this is maybe we'll edit this bit out, this is not an EOS pure thing, but I like to make the integrator function like the custodian of the scorecard, so that if we need to make a wholesale change or there's a process problem around the data itself, I like to make the integrator accountable for that. That's not necessarily something we prescribe. Perhaps that's my style. We'll put that in the style bucket.
Yeah. No,
Does that make sense?
that's a really good insight, because there's a lot of businesses that aren't necessarily data driven, but say, for example, quality control. You need to start to, if that's an important thing for hitting the goal, there may need to be a separate process to be able to collect, well, not only check, but then collect the data and feed up.
Yeah, absolutely. I work with an e-commerce, it's a fashion label e-commerce business, and one of their most important numbers to measure is returns. Not just the volume of return clothing predominantly, but also the value of returns, because they might have, 150 returns of an item that is worth, $5, or they might have 5 returns of an item that's worth $500. So they end up tracking both numbers, number of returns and value of returns. Whereas if there was like a cumulative number that was more insightful, there's probably an opportunity to develop that for Shopify, I think. But that would be, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's cool.
Awesome. Any other questions? We've still got 15 minutes or so to go. Rob, welcome. Oh, we had sorry, do you mind holding for a second, Rob? It's harder to do the raise hand function in a room like that. Sorry. Do you want to, in Manila, welcome. What's your question?
Hi, Dan. We're working with Roger. He's our EOS implementer.
Awesome.
So I'm been at it for about a year now. But in our organization, I think we've started for 2 quarters, 2016. And I guess I'm wondering, so when we look at the scorecard and there are like reds there, which means we have not met the goal, how do you then say that there's a process issue, or based on your experience, what's the data looking like for you to say that there's a process issue there, or the measurable has a process issue that's attached to it?
Yeah, so the first part, you try not to presuppose that that's what the issue is. So if a number is off track, always put it on your issues list. And so you still need to, so I'm going to cross across a few components here. So in the traction component, you have the level 10 meeting. And so your scorecard is a critical element of your level 10 meeting, as you'd be aware. And so when the number is missed or it's off track, you need to put that on your issues list and go through that IDS process: identify, discuss, solve. And so if the issue is that a operational number and output number is missed for that week, or it's the production that we're trying to deliver on a week-to-week basis is off track, and then we go through identify, discuss, solve, and when we're discussing it, we find that it's actually because a process is not being followed, then your solve would be to then, outside of that level 10 meeting, to go and investigate. And so sometimes early in the EOS journey, it might be because that process isn't documented, or it's not, it might be a training issue, or it might just be that it's out of date. So we need to go back and update that process. What I do find a lot of the time when a number is being missed because of a process, it's usually one of 4 things: that we didn't train people properly on it. We aren't measuring adequately the compliance of that process within a department. That we're not holding people sufficiently accountable to that, or it's out of date. So those 4 things, and a bit of a useful tip is if you go to your leadership team manual, which I have one on the table behind me here, there's what we call a followed by all checklist in the back of your folder, and it's those 4 things. So I didn't just brilliantly summarize those things. I read them in that list, and I know, well, not now, I've memorized them. But I know that though it's one of those 4 things, I'd say 98% of the time. And what that does is it allows you to be really agile in responding. So you miss the number, drop it to the issues list, identify, discuss, solve. The solve is usually to go and work out which one of those 4 things is the problem. And if you've missed it and it's a training issue, then it kind of becomes a loop, because I would say if there's a training, we haven't trained people sufficiently on a process, then I would review it and make sure it's up to date, and then retrain everybody within reason. If it's not, if it's a large workforce, it might be difficult to retrain everyone, but take that as a reminder that we probably need to retrain everybody, not just the person that caused us to miss that number. That was a really long answer, but hopefully that made sense. I'm prone to that.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Excellent. All right, thank you. And I love Roger, by the way. We know each other really well. I've been an EOS implementer for 5 years, and Roger was one of the originals in our region, which was about 6.5, nearly 7 years ago, I think. Yeah.
Everyone loves Roger.
Yeah, well, yes, you're right, they do, but I'm 100% genuine. Rob, thank you. Thanks for the question. I appreciate it. Rob.
Hi, Dan. Hi, everyone. Sorry for being late.
That's okay.
So
you're
also
half an hour time difference now, thanks to daylight saving.
We'll blame that. Yeah. And forgive me if this was already covered, but I was thinking through some of the points that I've been following. Something occurred to me as well. We've taken on some staff in the area of new sales and account management.
Great.
Building that team out. So as part of that, we've had pretty concise job descriptions and roles and so on defined through that hiring process, which is good. Some of which, of course, can inform KPIs. Some of those are in place. But my question really would be, as far as onboarding this early period that we're going through with these guys, they're quite experienced players. I'm wondering, do we keep the KPIs out of it? Do we keep those KPIs out of the scorecard altogether, going along the line of what Dan mentioned earlier in response to, I think, Anthony's question? Because really what we're hoping to do is, as a team, as a customer engagement team, build upon the leads that we're generating through our marketing efforts, increase our follow-up to initial meetings, increase the number of times and the quality of our contact with prospects, and see some of those flow through to realized works. So I'm just sort of asking this question on behalf of one of my workmates who runs that side of the company, and thinking, do we keep it out of our scorecard? Do we wait for the initial period of onboarding for these staff members to settle before bringing those numbers in? Because I do think they deserve a place in the scorecard for the leadership group.
My advice is start measuring as soon as possible. Not sure if you were here for it, but I talked about the importance of having like at least 13 weeks of data. So if you start measuring immediately and you identify the most important numbers to know on a week-to-week basis for that team, and you start measuring immediately, then you're able to see the change as they ramp, as they join. And then they're able to get a bit of a dopamine hit when they hit their number as well, and feel progress.
Yes.
And what you'll also find if you're bringing in new people with sales, account management capability, and they've done that function elsewhere, they can contribute to that conversation and just say, hey, in previous roles at other companies, we've measured these things and this is the effect that it's had. But also as a bit of general advice, whenever you have a new function or a new role, if it's sales or account management or whatever it is, and just focus on what you want from that role in the first, say they come in the first quarter. What do I want from my new salesperson, new account manager in the first quarter, and make that the number? Because sometimes it's sales. I'd say that's probably a little unrealistic in the first quarter, unless it's you're selling something that people are going to buy at really low barrier. But think about the behavior that you want, because just say it's new leads, then, you know, new leads is the number that you want. If it's appointments, or if it's appointments with existing customers, think about the behavior that you want to measure in that first quarter.
Yeah.
And then that probably takes the pressure off them a little bit, but it also focuses on them on the groundwork, the foundational stuff that you need them to do early days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And then it becomes sort of walk a mile, see a mile. Like you get to the end of the quarter and you've measured some of those behavioral things. Okay, so now let's lift our sights a little bit. What are some targets that we want to hit?
Yeah. So in that way as well,
a little bit.
yeah, and that way you're also reaffirming, underlining those things you want to see in them early doors, which is learn the processes, learn our toolkit, learn our mechanisms, and do apply yourself to getting more face-to-face meetings or more quality contact moments, rather than how many devices did you sell? Did you up our monthly recurring revenue or not? That's not where we're quite at with these people. You know, they're part of a team as well. So
spot on.
Cool.
And if you change that, if you get them to thinking about the behavioral part, is all those things that you just talked about will kind of happen as well. They will sell. I had a new team member join my business, my coaching practice. She's been with us for about 18 months now, but when she joined, she said, what is my number? What's my marker for success? And I said, well, you know what? This is going to sound really basic, but my biggest weakness is to-do completion. So if you can help me get to 80% or more to-do completion on a week-to-week basis, then we're going to have a long and prosperous relationship. So literally for the first quarter, I said to her, your only number in the first quarter is to-do completion is greater than 80%. And so then the beautiful thing about that was those to-dos needed to happen. So our output increased dramatically as a result of those to-dos getting done. And now I think our target's 90%, because she's so good at making sure things happen. And that's the fruit that was born from having a focus on activity rather than just hitting a number.
Cool. Excellent. Cheers, Dan.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got 5 minutes. I'm happy to keep going. I actually ironically have a level 10 meeting in an hour, in half an hour. Anthony, did you have another question?
Hi, Dan. Yeah, great questions, Rob. And also, this is, Dan, what you're talking about is the difference between setting your KPIs and activity-based stuff. That's really sort of what we're going through as well. And I really love that that to-do completion greater than 80%. I'm going to take that. That's sort of related to my first question, which was, you know, when we're tracking those activity-based things, that's one, especially with managers where they've got to-dos and they don't have, like, you know, routine tasks.
Yeah,
that's gold. Anyway,
a little bonus point on that one quickly. I don't want to completely derail your question.
Yeah.
I've started several companies just running on EOS before they were even born, actually. And when you often started with a scorecard in a startup, it can be hard to know, what do we measure? There's so many things, you get excited. And I literally just say to myself and my business partners, let's just measure to-do completion, because it's a really busy time in a new business. You got to do this, you got to meet with this supplier, website, blah, 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 all these things, domains. Just make those to-dos. And if we're doing 80% of our to-dos, then we actually get traction as a new business. Anyway, sorry.
Awesome. Yeah, so in relation to the question, you said have a separate, KPIs and targets dashboard. At the moment, we're using My90 as our EOS software.
Okay.
And that's got, it's already got a particular scorecard with numbers and so, like an Excel-based data. When you're separating in terms of things like that, how are you doing that? Are you using a different type of software? Are you creating a different team or a different? Yeah, I mean, as opposed to the other. The other numbers.
I'd be using. So this is preference, so I've got to be careful. I don't want to inflict my style on you. I use another platform, EOS One. It's EOS's equivalent. I've used Traction Tools and I've used 90 as well. I try and keep the data in there for the EOS process. So like for the serving the scorecards that then serve the level 10 meeting, and only that. And all other numbers, KPIs, dashboards, there will be better solutions for that in the market. And keep your 90, your traction tools, your EOS 1 as the place where we keep all the data as it relates to EOS. There are a lot of, there's solutions like Fathom, there are solutions like Spotlight, there's tools like Bright Gauge, there's all these beautiful tools that are really good at KPIs and dashboards, and they're intuitive. But just make sure you use the same data for 90 or EOS 1 as well, so that they're consistent. I wouldn't, because then you don't want it to be completely separate, but they're different mindsets. So the scorecard is weekly, finger on the pulse as a part of that level 10 meeting pulse. And then your KPIs, your dashboards are like that instrument cluster while I'm driving down the road as an individual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So the EOS data, the scorecards are sort of like traction related. And the other ones are sort of maybe performance related, like just like in your dashboard in your car.
Yeah, and you want them to be more accessible than in just a level 10 meeting as well, all those other things. If you've got widgets and dashboards that will help people know whether they're in real time, whether they're on track, you don't want to have to go into another system for that. You want to have it displayed and accessible. Yeah.
Thanks.
Excellent. Great question. Thank you. Thank you all. Look, we got up to the time, allotted time. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much for asking questions. It's far more interesting for all of us if you provide the majority of the content, which you did that. So thank you. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you are enjoying learning through this Strong in 6 process. And if they're all deep dives into the different components, I encourage you to roll along with them. Got some really talented people that are putting their time together for this. So thank you so much. Thank you for your support of this process and Strong in 6. I'm Dan Williams. Enjoy the rest of your week. Have fun, and make sure that you are asking those questions.